One of the craziest Clásicos in recent times ended 3-2 as Barcelona won the Supercopa de España for the 16th time. Aside from perhaps the most insane half-time stoppage time period I can remember, what tactics did we see from Hansi Flick and Xabi Alonso's sides? Well, let's take a look, beginning with Barca in possession as they ended with almost 70% of the ball. For most of the first half, Madrid had no interest in pressing high up the pitch, allowing Barca to emerge through the first phase of play unchallenged. And what looked like a back four on paper was actually a five in practice, as Tchouaméni slotted in alongside Huijsen, with Valverde occupying the right wing-back position. And this more passive approach allowed Barcelona to settle into possession, which was an interesting shape, with Koundé tucking in fairly narrow early in the possession and Balde pushing on the left. But it was the midfield structure that was interesting, as most high possession sides, particularly in deep possession, will tend to keep their midfielders in close proximity to allow easy circulation of the ball. But Barca often initially did the opposite, with De Jong being very much a solo pivot, with Fermín López and Pedri staying a lot higher and slightly wider. So why was this? Well, Madrid in the defense were actually in more of a 5-3-2, and it was Rodrigo who was expected to operate in this left central midfield position. And because Balde was so high up down the left, Rafinha had the freedom to tuck in and potentially create a lopsided diamond, meaning that if the Real Madrid midfield was more passive, with the backline already 3 versus 2 down, De Jong might have been able to get on the ball anyway. Asensio often took responsibility of tracking Rafinha, meaning that this was not the case. However, if Vinicius and Garcia were more narrow, Koundé began to see a lot more of the ball in these wider regions, and Rodrigo would find himself being drawn to the Frenchman in these positions. And this was backed up by Fermín López, who would often look to make himself available in these right-back positions to begin that right side overload. But Camavinga was disciplined in looking to track the Spaniard. But what it did mean was now Frenkie de Jong often found himself as the free man, because the midfielders ahead of him were pinning Madrid's own midfielders, now giving him the room to dictate the game. It became absolutely vital for one of Vinicius or Garcia to drop deep and be man-oriented and look to cover de Jong to try and even things up in that midfield. As if the Dutchman did receive the ball goal side of these two, they could be in a very vulnerable defensive position. But the problem with this is as the first half went on, it forced Madrid to become more and more passive, until more often than not, all 11 players could find themselves in their own third. And that's actually a big reason why in that first half, Real Madrid actually only had 24% possession. But defensively, this shape actually did help Madrid, primarily in making sure the center of the pitch was practically inaccessible. The deeper midfielders would look to keep eyes on Fermín and Pedri if they stayed high up the pitch, and the back five allowed the wider centre-backs to be more man-oriented when players like Rafinha did look to drop into the midfield as well. And as the half went on, we ended up seeing a lot more of Pedri becoming the second pivot alongside Frenkie de Jong to help progression alongside the Dutchman. But again, Madrid were fairly solid through the centre, but what began to see La Blaugrana looking more threatening was constant rotations. With so many players in central zones, the constant movement would be enough to momentarily draw defenders out of position to get players into dangerous zones. And this is the perfect example, as again we see Fermín and Pedri high, with Rafinha in that tucked in position. As Pedri receives, Balde stays deep to force Valverde high up the pitch. The opposing movements then come into play, as Rafinha drops, meaning that both of these Madrid men are now pushing in this direction, allowing Pedri to move in the opposite direction, leading to a shot inside the box. But beyond rotations, it was the wide regions that proved to be key. Real's defense zeroed in on protecting the center of the pitch, meaning that there was now potential for isolations out wide. But down the left, Valverde was able to cope with Balde pretty easily, so the real danger was down the right. This could be simply through Koundé finding Yamal 1 versus 1 against Carreras, especially if Rodrigo had initially been drawn to Koundé. And it was a good battle between the two, but often Yamal was able to get into areas where he could create. But at times, Koundé himself was a lot more aggressive, even looking to overlap outside of Yamal, or at least occupy the half space in order to create an overload with Fermín López included, again using that right hand side to create danger. But the danger, of course, was on the transition, as whether Koundé was deep, but especially when he had ventured up the pitch, Vinicius spotted his opportunity. He would constantly look to push out to the flank, and though Barca weren't playing an offside trap in the match, they still had an incredibly high line, which meant there was plenty of room for the likes of Vinicius to attack. And that's exactly what we see for Real's first goal. And Madrid's game plan did shift completely in the second half though. But just before we get there, don't forget, if you want to accelerate your tactical understanding, check out my free 1-month program, Football Fundamentals, which you can sign up for free through the link in the description below this video. From the first whistle in the second half, Los Blancos were much more aggressive in the press, as they shifted to a front three to match Barcelona's build-up, while the remaining two midfielders would look to be aggressive on the pivots. And it was effective, with Barca now having to fight to get out of their own third, with Real clawing back the possession stats. But as always, it's all about balancing risk and reward. And this more aggressive stance did mean that Barca were able to find more players in space between the lines. And again, the opposing movements, particularly between these three, caused headaches, as at any moment, one of them could be dropping deep or running in behind, making them extremely difficult to track. But what was happening when Madrid were in possession? Well, there's a reason they struggled to hold on to the ball. Early on, they decided to essentially take zero risks, as even though they did set up to begin shorter times, if Barca even threatened to press, Courtois would immediately take the long option. And early on in the game, this was, of course, ineffective. But as Vinicius began pulling out to the left more and more, he was often able to bring the ball down and attack Kubasi and Koundé, despite on paper not being an aerial target. But in open play, Madrid would shift from the 5 to a back 4, with Asensio providing the width. But Barca were especially aggressive in their press, switching to a front 2, with Yamal and Balde also backing up the press in the wide areas, meaning essentially they were man-to-man against the backline, making it impossible to play out at times. Especially because Real only had a midfield 2 at times when Rodrigo pushed high up early. Valverde did try to compensate for this at times, as he could invert, allowing Bellingham to push higher up, but in general, Los Blancos were struggling to play through this first line of pressure, meaning often there were turnovers in these higher positions. This wasn't helped by the fact that because these two men had to be so deep in the build-up, it often meant that there were such large gaps between them and the front line that even when Real did escape the press, there was limited support coming from the midfield, why they had to depend so heavily on the solo magic from Vinicius when they found him wide left, which he was often able to supply. But what did you make of this encounter? There was so much going on that not every tactical paradigm could be covered, so I'm really looking forward to reading your comments down below. And don't forget to sign up for Football Fundamentals through that link down below. And for your next video, why not take a deep dive into the entire tactical evolution of Pep Guardiola?